bills to reopen parts of the federal government. This is a strategy Senate Majority Leader Reid has declared a non-starter in the Senate. We hope to hear more from the Democratic and Republican leaders shortly, but right now live to the Senate floor on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Have mercy upon us, O God, and save us from the madness. We acknowledge our transgressions, our shortcomings, our smugness, our selfishness, and our pride. Create in us clean hearts, O God, and renew a right spirit within us. Deliver us from the hypocrisy of attempting to sound reasonable while being unreasonable. Remove the burdens of those who are the collateral damage of this government shutdown, transforming negatives into positives as you work for the good of those who love you. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., October 3rd, 2013. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Brian Schatz, a senator from the state of Hawaii, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Under the previous order, having received H.J. Res. 70, 71, and 73 from the House, the measures are considered to have received their second readings, and objection to further proceedings is considered to have been heard for purposes of Rule 14.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Following Leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 2 p.m. this afternoon. Senators will be permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes during that period of time. The first hour will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders of the designees. The Republicans will control the first 30 minutes and the majority the second 30 minutes. Mr. President, yesterday I made the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John Boehner, an offer I thought he couldn't refuse, but he did. House Republican leaders had demanded that Senate join them in a conference committee to work out budget differences. That seemed like a good idea to me. That's why Democrats yesterday asked consent to do exactly that. Go to conference. Mr. President, on anything. You want to talk about spending, you want to talk about health care, you want to talk about agriculture, you want to talk about the post office, it doesn't matter. We're happy to, we in our agreement that we propose to them, whatever you want to talk about. So I formally offered that. I first did it in a letter to the Speaker. I talked to him, and then I came to the floor here and reiterated the offer. My only condition, that the conferees negotiate in the light of day while the government is open for business. It doesn't seem too unreasonable. To my surprise, the Speaker refused and the Senate Republicans objected. House Republicans truly don't know what they want. They can't take yes for an answer now. We've agreed to their budget number, which we thought should be higher. We agreed to that. They want to go to conference. We agreed to that. But, Mr. President, they've had trouble agreeing to anything for quite some time now. This spring, after years of Republicans loudly longing for a budget passed by the Senate, despite already having a budget with the force of law, we decided, let's give them their way. And we worked hard, led by Senator Murray, to a budget that we completed after 5 o'clock in the morning. Voted on over 100 amendments. Then Senate Democrats, following what they said, the Republicans said they wanted, regular order, said let's go to conference to work out the differences. They passed their budget, we passed ours. Guess what? After all this haranguing about having a budget, regular order, they decided they didn't like that so well. It was really very difficult to comprehend. When Republicans finally got what they said they wanted, it turned out they didn't want it after all. Yesterday, same story. Republicans asked to go to conference on a budget. Democrats agree. Republicans object. These tactics truly, Mr. President, are back to Orwellian. They believe that if you go east, you're really going west. If you're going north, you're really going south. You're not going down, you're going up. Whatever, obviously, they say doesn't really mean anything in reality. But, Mr. President, maybe they really don't know what they want. Maybe they don't have a game plan. And it's becoming more apparent every day. One of the House Republican Tea Party leaders, Congressman from Indiana by the name of Stutzman, admitted this to one of the Washington newspapers yesterday. Here's what he said. This is a quote. Listen to this, Mr. President. Here's what he said. We're not going to be disrespected. We have to get something out of this. Now listen to this, last phrase of his statement. But I don't know what that is. If there's any way I disrespected him or we disrespected him, we don't want that to happen. We apologize. They want to get something out of this? Well, let's consider that. Except they don't know what they want. A little hard to make a deal there, isn't it, Mr. President? Republicans should come to their senses and realize there's more than wounded pride in line. The longer this Republican government shutdown persists, the harder it will be on our economy. I hope they can figure out what it is that they want before the damage, the economic recovery, is even more irreversible than they've already created. It's obvious the strain of self-inflicted shutdown is beginning to wear on many Republicans. Pick up the papers today. Listen to the news. There were reports of vicious infighting from yesterday's Republican caucus meeting. This is what one Republican said after the meeting, and I quote, "It was very evident to everyone in the room that the junior senator from Texas doesn't have a strategy. He never had a strategy and could never answer a question about what the end game was, just like Stutzman from Indiana." That's the end of the quote, Mr. President. That's the danger of following the Tea Party, because you follow them, you're headed off the cliff, and that's where we have been, and that's where we already are, trying to get out of the cliff that they created, that they put us over, I should say. Tea Party Republicans don't really want a way out of the government shutdown. I read here direct statements yesterday from one of their candidates. She's a congressman. She ran for president. She said, finally, we've gotten what we want. We've shut down government. So I think my statements I made about their being anarchists is pretty valid. They're glad the government shut down. They don't believe in government. A government shutdown is the end game for them, obviously. Tea Party Republicans don't really want a way out of this government shutdown. They like it the way it is. But, Mr. President, in addition to the statement coming from the Republican Senate caucus, there's some rumblings over in the House. More than 20 reasonable Republicans in the House have said on the record that they're ready to pass a way to fund this government right now. Now, Mr. President, I wasn't a math major, far from it, but I can count. If those 20 reasonable Republicans unite with 200 House Democrats, that's a majority in the House of Representatives. That would end the shutdown now. So I have a message for my mainstream Republican colleagues. If you ever hope to get out of this mess, if you ever hope to end this Republican government shutdown, get rid of the Tea Party direction. Work with us. Help us reopen the government. We can start negotiations today. Mr. President, as everyone knows, I think, I had a meeting with Leader McConnell, Speaker Boehner, and Leader Pelosi last night in the White House. The Speaker said after the meeting, of course it was obvious during the meeting, the only thing he cares about is Obamacare. That's what this is all about. They don't care about anything else. And, Mr. President, we know what this government shutdown has done to our country already. General Clapper, one of the leaders in our intelligence gathering information around the world, has stated that 72% of people who work in our intelligence agencies are home, watching TV, reading a book. They're not at work, protecting us from the bad people around the world, and there are lots of them. We've talked about our national parks here. It's really been bad for people coming to Nevada who want to do things in our parks. But not only for them, it's hurt business in Nevada, as it has around the country. NIH. Mr. President, we all understand how important it is that people who are sick and ill have the ability to have the best care in the world. If you're at the end of the line and you're fortunate enough to be able to say, well, maybe there's still another chance, or doing something back in Washington at one of the National Institutes of Health, and maybe they can help you. Not now. Can't do it now because of the Republicans. Centers for Disease Control. Not a very glamorous sounding name, but that's what it's about. Controlling disease. Most of them are furloughed. Senator Harkin came on the floor yesterday and talked about a real serious problem. They couldn't figure out what it was. People were sick and dying. Centers for Disease Control figured it out. It was because of pomegranate seeds coming from some other country. They work on these scourges every day because there are things come up that make people sick. We're in flu season now. They're not working on that. Now, the second in command of the House of Representatives, Congressman Cantor, said yesterday, well, that's okay. We know that there's a lot of problems around the country with the shutdown, but we're going to, one by one, reopen those agencies. Mr. President, it's so obvious. It's so obvious. This is all directed toward President Obama's signature legislation, Obamacare. They want to piecemeal this and wind up trying to hurt Obamacare. Even Dr. Coburn, who is a medical doctor, never known for being a shrinking violet, has said this is not the way to go. Obamacare is funded, except for maybe 10%. Mr. President, we're willing to sit down and talk about anything they want to talk about in conference, but the government has to open first. It's time for my Republican friends to defy your Tea Party overlords. Every day that passes, the idea of shutting down the government in order to repeal Obamacare is becoming so transparent and so bad for the country. No one I mean, Mr. President, it wasn't very popular for them to do it anyway. Every day that goes by, it's less popular. Concerning only a handful of Americans supported the strategy, I said to begin with, it's a bad sign for them, the Republicans. Millions of Americans have visited federal marketplace exchanges for the last 3 days. Demand is so high that on some of the websites, they crashed. This is not unprecedented. Google, when first started, they experienced the same challenges. State-based exchanges have flourished virtually every place. Take, for example, my friend, the Republican leader state of Kentucky. More than 100,000 people have already visited the state's health care exchange website. More than 10,000 people have filled out applications for health coverage, and more than 3,000 Kentucky families have already enrolled in new coverage. This shows the hunger the American people have to sign up for affordable health care. Now, we've had Republicans come here, but it's just so bad for the job market. Mr. President, throughout the press today, I want to pick a few of them. Take, for example, one out of the New York Times. Speaker Boehner said, it's job killing. Ted Cruz, it's hurting American people. Senator McConnell, it's a big reason we're turning into a nation of part-time workers. I'm not going to go through all the economists, but they all say the same thing. It doesn't hurt jobs at all. Take, for example, Mark Zandi, Moody's Analytics, by the way, who was John McCain when he ran for president, his chief economic advisor. Here's what he said yesterday, I quote, I don't see any evidence Obamacare is impacting the job market. A man by name of Gregory Mankiw, M-A-N-K-I-W, Harvard economist, who worked for President George W. Bush, when asked about how it affected the economy, not a whole lot. So, Mr. President, there are many more quotes, but you get the picture. When the history books are written, and they will be written, Obamacare will be seen as the greatest single step since Medicare to provide fairness to all Americans. The more America learns about affordable care provided in Obamacare, the more they like it. And Republicans should be wise to abandon their impractical quest to repeal it. It's been the law for 4 years.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
I want to start out this morning with a point that's obvious to me, but I think bears repeating. Nobody wants the shutdown. Democrats say they don't want it. Republicans certainly don't want it. We all can agree on at least that. The question at this point is, how do we resolve the issues that really truly divide us? That really divide us. And the point I've been making all week is simply this. The only thing keeping the government from opening back up is the Democrats' refusal to apply a very simple principle of fairness when it comes to Obamacare. Let's treat everybody the same. Let's treat everybody the same. Basically, all the House is asking for at this point, they wanted a lot more, but all they're asking for at this point is a level playing field when it comes to Obamacare. That's about the only thing standing in the way of the government opening back up. And it's a pretty reasonable request. And if Washington Democrats can't agree to that, then can they at least join us in making sure veterans programs are funded, that the honor flight veterans can visit the World War II Memorial, and that the National Institutes of Health can continue its research? Can we at least agree on that? That's just the right thing to do. It responds directly to the concerns that a number of our Democratic colleagues have raised, and it's the same thing this Congress voted to do just a couple of days ago with the brave men and women of our military. So I really hope my friends across the aisle will reflect on the efforts of Republicans in the House and allow the Senate to quickly vote on all the bills the House sent us last night so we can get the government reopened as soon as possible. That said, yesterday's meeting at the White House, frankly, wasn't particularly encouraging. The President basically called us all down there to tell us he's not interested in negotiating. It was essentially a negotiation about not negotiating. And now we hear he's off campaigning today in Rockville rather than sitting down to get this thing solved, which is certainly disappointing. But here's the good news. A solution isn't that far from reach. As I said, nobody wants the shutdown, so that's a good start. And it's hard to argue with what Republicans are asking for, especially after the embarrassing rollout of Obamacare exchanges on Tuesday. I mean, one of the folks the president had standing behind him at the White House tried to log on and sign up for Obamacare, and after a couple of unsuccessful attempts, the Post reports that she gave up, just literally gave up. And here's the quote she gave afterwards: "It's not so great." Not so great? Some Americans might call that an understatement. You would think the administration would be begging for a delay after stories like that. So this should be easy. Congress gets treated the same way as everybody else on the Obamacare exchanges, and individuals get the same break that the president already handed out to employers. The same break the president's already unilaterally given to employers. It's time for Democrats to start acting responsibly. It's time to work with us and get our way out of this mess.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for debate only until 2 p.m., with the first hour equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first 30 minutes and the majority controlling the second 30 minutes, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Mr. President.
Republican whip.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent to be allowed to engage in a colloquy with the Republican leader, the senator from Missouri, the senator from Georgia, if he wishes to join, and the senator from South Dakota during the 30 minutes allocated to our side.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. I came to the floor, and I'm happy to do that. But I was told there was going to be a consent agreement. I'm sorry, a consent ask. If that's not the case, you can go ahead and do your colloquy, and I'll come back when you want to do that.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Republican whip.
For the information of the majority leader and anyone else who's interested, there will be some unanimous consent requests. We will front load those, and so the majority leader doesn't have to stay on the floor more than maybe about 10 minutes, if that suits his schedule.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
Mr. President, many of us were stunned this week to see the administration blocking the World War II memorial. It was a reminder to all of us how much we owe the greatest generation. Last week, the Senate unanimously agreed to ensure our troops are paid during the shutdown, and the President correctly signed it into law immediately. Today, the House will pass a bill to ensure that our veterans, in fact they've done that, continue to get the services and benefits they so richly deserve. If Democrats are unwilling to fund other parts of the government, at the very least they can agree to support our veterans. And so, as the Senator from Texas and the Majority Leader were just discussing, I have the first of these unanimous consent requests to propound. I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate receives H.J. Res. 72, making continuing appropriations for veterans benefits for fiscal year 2014, that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, my friend notes that no one wants to shut the government down. Obviously, he didn't listen to my statement. We have people who have been saying for days now, they're Republicans saying they're glad the government's shut down. They've been waiting for this for years. I even quoted the woman from Minnesota that said that, Congresswoman from Minnesota. And Congressman Marlin Stutzman, Indiana, tells where the Tea Party is. He said, we're not going to be disrespected. We have to get something out of this. And I don't know exactly what that is. So Republicans are throwing one crazy idea on the wall, hoping that maybe one of them will stick. They throw one idea, and then we come with another one, in hopes that I repeat, something will stick up on that wall, because they don't really know which wall they're even throwing it on. The latest plan came from the junior senator from Texas is to cherry-pick parts of the government he likes. House Republican leader Cantor admitted the strategy. According to the New York Times, here's what he said, and this is a quote. He was asked, what about those cancer patients that need some help? He said, when asked, what about disadvantaged kids that want to return to their Head Start classes? He said, this is a direct quote, that's coming as well. We're going to take every issue that has come up and put it on the floor. He is following Cruz's idea specifically. Senator Cruz is now joint speaker. He lectures the House on occasion, as he does people over here. Mr. President, we support veterans and parks and NIH and all these different elements of government that are closed. But we also are not going to choose between veterans, cancer research, disease control, highway safety, or the FBI. And we're not going to give a blank check to the junior senator from Texas to pick his favorite parts of government on a daily basis. Today, it's the parks. Tomorrow, it's NIH. Maybe later it'll be something else.
Would the leader yield for a question?
I would be happy to.
Just I wanted to follow up on what he said. So if we were to go along with these individual UC requests, wouldn't...
Is there objection to the request?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. Here's a situation. The junior senator of Texas wants to fund everything else, just not Obamacare. Here's what one columnist said today on the Washington Post, Dana Milbank. Quote, and I'll be quick, I know you guys have a lot to talk about here. Quote, House Republicans continue what might be called the lifeboat strategy, deciding which government functions are worth saving. In, this is what they like, veterans, the troops, and tourist attractions out, poor children, pregnant women, and just about every government function that regulates business or requires people to pay taxes. Here are some of the functions not boarding.
Is that an objection?
I will use leader time then, Mr. President.
Without objection.
So if they're afraid to listen to this stuff I have to say, they should listen, because the government is closed. And it's closed because they've helped close it. So let's not try to be technical here. I want to say something. I'm going to say it. Here are some of the functions not boarding the GOP lifeboats. Market regulation, chemical spill investigation, antitrust enforcement, worksite immigration checks, workplace safety inspections, Environmental Protection Agency, communications and trade regulations, nutrition for 9 million children and pregnant women, flu monitoring and other functions, centers for disease control, and housing rental assistance for the poor. Here's what else he wrote. That's quite a list that the Tea Party is throwing out of the boat. We need to end the government shutdown. I say that without any reservation. The key to reopening the government still remains the Senate-passed funding resolution. Let's open the government. We will talk about anything they want to talk about. We've said that. Now, so, Mr. President, I ask consent that their request be modified as follows. That an amendment which is at the desk be agreed to. That the joint resolution is amended, then be read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate. This amendment is a text that passed the Senate and is a clean continuing resolution for the entire government, and is something that is already over in the House and reportedly has the support of a majority of the members of the House of Representatives, including at least 20 Republicans, and some reports as many as 100.
Is there objection to the modified request?
Object.
The objection is heard.
I object to the
Is there
objection
to the original request?
Mr. President.
The objection is heard. Republican leader.
Mr. President, with all due respect to my good friend, the majority leader, he was speaking about the junior senator from Texas, who I don't see on the floor here at the moment. The request was made by the minority leader, the Republican leader of the Senate, and it dealt quite appropriately with veterans' benefits. That was the whole thing. And I just would repeat, I was the one who requested consent that we provide relief to veterans during the shutdown. And the person to whom the speech seemed to be directed, I don't see on the floor at the moment. But with that, I know we're in the middle of a colloquy here, and the Republican whip has a proposal to make.
The Republican whip.
Mr. President, I just want to raise as a preliminary matter, under Rule 19 of the Senate rules, no senator shall in debate directly or indirectly by any form of words impute to another senator or to other senators any conduct or motive unworthy or unbecoming a senator. I just want to remind all of our colleagues that when they talk about members of the United States Senate who are not on the floor and not here and able to defend themselves, that I think, if not the letter of the rule, the spirit is in jeopardy of being transgressed. And I just think we don't want to head down that path. But I would just point out that we have witnessed, really with some dismay, many of our World War II veterans being turned away at the World War II Memorial here in Washington, D.C. Now, a number of these honor flights come from my state. There'll be one that comes here tomorrow afternoon. I intend to meet them and to welcome them to Washington and visit the World War II Memorial with them. And these gentlemen and ladies are quite advanced in years, and for many of them, like, for example, my father-in-law, who landed on Utah Beach on the second day of the Normandy invasion, his physical health is not such that he could come, but he would love to come to the United States.
Question?
I would not yield for a question at this time. I will at a later time. He would love to come to visit the World War II Memorial. Unfortunately, his health is not such that he can, but those who can are coming to Washington. There'll be one from Fort Worth coming here on Tuesday, and I intend to meet them and to welcome them. And they should not be turned back because of this politically concocted government shutdown, one that the President and the Majority Leader seem to be enjoying, but which is causing a lot of hardship and inconvenience. So the House of Representatives has passed a separate piece of legislation that would open up the World War II Memorial, along with other national park services. I would note it got 252 votes in the House of Representatives yesterday, including 23 Democrats, and I would hope it would enjoy the same sort of bipartisan support here in the United States Senate. So, Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.J. Res. 70, making continuing appropriations for National Park Service operations, which was received from the House. I ask further that consent that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the statement I just made in response to Senator McConnell's consent agreement appear in the record following my objection.
Without objection? Is there
object.
Original request?
I object. Mr. President, let me inquire. Did the Majority Leader object to my unanimous consent request or to seek to amend it?
The objection has not yet been heard. Is there objection?
Okay, fine. Object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President, I recognize my colleague from Missouri and South Dakota, who I know also have unanimous consent requests, and I would yield to them for those.
I thank my friend from Texas for yielding. On Monday morning, I was scheduled to be at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, to look at some of their research. A lot of the research that NIH does has been done in our state. A third of the research for the Human Genome Project was done in our state. And then on Tuesday evening, for the 5th year in a row, I was at the fundraising event for the National Institute, the Children's Inn at the National Institute of Health, where families and children can stay while they're there for treatment. This is a private sector event, and in spite of everything else that was going on, it was a great event where lots of money was raised for those kids. I said at that event that somebody told me years ago that if everybody in your family is well, you have lots of problems. If somebody in your family is sick, you have one problem. And the Children's Inn is one of the places where people help families deal with the one problem they have. But as virtually every member of this Senate at one time or another has said, the work at the NIH is important. It's important that it continue. The House yesterday passed a House joint resolution that would continue that work. Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.J. Res. 73, making continuing appropriations for the National Institutes of Health for the fiscal year 2014. I ask further consent that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and the motion be to reconsider, be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Assistant Majority Leader.
reserving the right to object, I'm going to make a counteroffer to the gentleman from the senator from Missouri, which is even better. It's going to open the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, all of the medical research at the Department of Defense. We're going to make sure that all of the medical research and medical services of the federal government in every agency at every level are open for business immediately. And the senator from Missouri, by agreeing to this modification, will go way beyond the National Institutes of Health. He is going to be opening up all of these medical services. And therefore, I ask consent that the request be modified as follows. That an amendment which is at the desk be agreed to, the joint resolution is amended, then be read a 3rd time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This amendment is the text that passed the Senate, is a clean, continuing resolution for the entire government, including the National Institutes of Health, and is something that is already over in the House, reportedly has the support of a majority of the members of the House of Representatives. This is an opportunity for the senator from Missouri to finally break down this government shutdown and put all the medical services of the federal government back in business immediately.
Is there objection to the modified request?
Reserving the right to object, I just remind my good friend from Illinois that there was a time when actually in the Senate we dealt with all of these issues individually, as we should have last year, and didn't. There were no appropriations bills on the floor. CR, continuing resolution, is not the best way to do the business of the country, and I would object.
The objection is heard. Is there objection to the original request?
I object.
The objection is heard.
I yield to the senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, the men and women who serve in our nation's armed services shouldn't be impacted by a partial government shutdown. Recently, the House and Senate unanimously passed the Pay Our Military First Act, which was signed into law by the President this past Monday. That bill ensures that active duty military and those who support them stay on the job regardless of the dysfunction here in Washington. Congress was right, Mr. President, and to pass the legislation, and President Obama was right to immediately sign it into law. Today, the House of Representatives is going to pass H.R. 3230, the Pay Our Guard and Reserve Act. This bill provides funding to pay Guard and Reserve troops who are not currently on active duty. And although these men and women currently don't have active duty status, they have regularly scheduled training requirements. They stand ready to serve in overseas conflicts and to respond to domestic disasters when called upon by their country. These men and women proudly serve the country, and they should not be impacted by spending disagreements here in Washington. Today, the Senate has a chance to give these individuals and their families greater certainty by passing H.R. 3230 as soon as it is received from the House. Now, I'm sorry to hear that the majority and the President have already indicated that they're going to oppose this and that the President has threatened to veto this legislation. I can't imagine that we would not do for our Guard and Reserve troops what we've already done for our active duty troops. I think that is a big mistake, Mr. President. So I would ask unanimous consent that when the Senate receives H.R. 3230, making continuing appropriations during a government shutdown to provide pay and allowances to members of the reserve components of the armed forces, that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered and made and laid upon the table.
Mr. President?
Is there objection?
Mr. President, I would ask that the senator from Illinois, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, the Subcommittee on Defense, respond.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I am going to offer to the senator from South Dakota an even better deal. Not only will we help the reservists, not only will we open the Veterans Administration, but out of the 800,000 furloughed employees, over 500,000 of them are veterans, and 1/4 of those veteran federal employees are disabled. Now I'm going to give the gentleman from South Dakota an opportunity to put them all back to work immediately, every one of them, including paying the reservists and everything he suggested. I ask consent that the request of the senator from South Dakota be modified as follows: that an amendment which is at the desk be agreed to, that the bill as amended then be read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This amendment is the text that passed the Senate. It is a clean, continuing resolution for the entire government and will put over 500,000 veterans and over 100,000 disabled veterans who are federal employees back to work. Is something already in the House, reportedly has the support of a majority of the members of the House of Representatives.
Is there objection to the modified request?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, as the senator from Illinois has already pointed out, that's already passed the Senate. What he's suggesting is already in the House, not being acted on. What the Senate can act on is legislation that's being sent here from the House that would ensure that our National Guard and Reserve troops are treated the same way that our active duty troops are treated. And I think that's only fair, it's only fitting. These are people who not only respond to domestic disasters in this country, but also are involved in conflicts overseas on a regular basis, and so I would object.
The objection is heard to the modified request. Is there objection to the original request?
Mr. President, on behalf of 500,000 veteran federal employees, a fourth of whom are disabled, I object.
The objection is heard. Republican Whip.
Inquire how much time is remaining in our allocated time?
13 minutes.
Mr. President, I grew up in an Air Force family. My dad served in World War II in the Army Air Corps, and as I've mentioned on this floor many times, continued to serve for 31 years in the United States Air Force. And so, as fate would have it, he was transferred to Tachikawa Air Force Base in Japan when I was a senior, actually right after my junior year in high school. So I graduated from high school in Japan. And I became acquainted with this 17th century stylized form of drama and dancing called kabuki. And the thing about kabuki is that the audience oohs and ahs as the actors demonstrate their great skill at carrying out this stylized form of drama and dance. But what we've seen here on this government shutdown, contrived as it is a form of kabuki. We know exactly what's happening here. The Senate, under the majority leader, has turned down at least 4, and now here today, 4 more, proposals from the House of Representatives to try to mitigate some of the hardship as a result of their determination to protect the special congressional carve-out from Obamacare, which was tabled the other day at the instance of the majority leader, as well as to deny average Americans the same opportunity that the President has unilaterally given to employers to delay the implementation of Obamacare for 1 year when it comes to the individual mandate. That's what the majority has objected to. That's what the majority leader in a party line vote has tabled, and that's the only reason we are engaged in a government shutdown, because of their refusal to accept those reasonable conditions from the House of Representatives. So this is kabuki, as we here in America understand it. We all understand the dance. We understand this is a form of drama. But the problem is the American people are suffering either hardship or great inconvenience as a result of the unwillingness of the President of the United States to negotiate, and the hard line, my way or the highway position of the majority party. So I would just ask my colleagues who are here on the floor, both of whom served with great distinction in the House of Representatives, whether they believe that the House has acted in good faith, whether they've tried to resolve this impasse by sending over to the Senate reasonable pieces of legislation, which, if accepted by the majority, could break this impasse and reopen the federal government. I would ask the senator from Missouri to respond first.
I would just say to my friend from Texas that until the leadership in the Senate changed the current leadership 7 years ago, we always did appropriations by debating and advancing individual things. The idea that we would only do this by, we don't want to debate anything if we don't debate everything, that makes no sense. It's not the way the government should run. I think the House is not only well-intended, that their goal is a worthy goal. And at the National Institute of Health, the House of Representatives, led by Republicans, beginning in 1995, doubled NIH funding in 10 years. My good friend from South Dakota and I were there for the majority of that 10-year doubling of NIH funding. Last year in the Appropriations Committee markup, I voted for a bill that would add $1 billion extra to NIH funding. It was defeated in the committee. This year I voted for a bill that would add almost $1.5 billion of additional funding to NIH funding. This makes a difference in the lives of people. Francis Collins, the director of NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, has estimated that each week that there's a shutdown, his agency's research hospital would have to turn away an estimated 200 patients. He estimated 30 of those patients would be children. Every week of a shutdown. Now, I know that they took the children and the individuals that were coming Monday and Tuesday, but are now beginning to notify people, if you were scheduled to come, we've got 4,000 people working and 14,000 people not working. We can't accept you right now. And I think this is the right thing to do. It's an easy thing to do if we would just stand up and do it. If we don't oppose NIH, and I don't believe there's a senator that does, why don't we continue their funding and do it right now?
Mr. President, I would ask the senator from Missouri, I heard the assistant leader on the Democratic side, the majority side, yesterday make what I thought was a very impassioned speech on behalf of access to research that's provided by the NIH for children who are suffering from cancer. And I would just ask the senator from Missouri, is the bill that the House has passed and that you asked consent, that the Senate consider, would it address the very same sort of cancer research for children that the assistant majority leader was arguing for yesterday?
Well, I was impressed by my friend from Illinois' comments yesterday about NIH funding. I'm for NIH funding. I've never failed to vote for NIH funding. I've frankly never failed to vote on an amendment that would increase NIH funding, as far as I know, and I've seen it increase dramatically, and opening the doors of that research facility is the right thing to do. We could do it today. I can't imagine the President wouldn't sign a bill that let three-quarters of that workforce go back to work and let the 200 people that will be turned away in the next 7 days be told instead, come on, be part of this process. We're waiting for you. We're here. We're doing the kinds of things that your family critically needs us to do.
I would ask the senator from South Dakota. I know South Dakota has a lot of uniformed military, and the senator has already addressed a piece of legislation that's passed the House and come over here. Is it your impression that the House is trying to address some of the hardships and inconvenience in some cases, hardships in others, that are caused by the government shutdown? And in your experience, are they being reasonable and demonstrating their good faith in trying to break this impasse?
I would say to our distinguished whip, the senator from Texas, and that is exactly correct. The House of Representatives has moved several pieces of legislation, and will this morning, that address some of what we think are the real needs out there in the midst of a very unnecessary government shutdown. Some of those have been mentioned here on the floor this morning. I'd just point out, too, in addition to taking care of our Guard and Reserve troops as we have our active duty troops, is really important. All of us have Guard units and families who are impacted by this, and the House of Representatives has given us an opportunity to do that. The other thing I would mention, I spoke yesterday about President Obama's refusal to open up the World War II Memorial for veterans on their honor flight. He rejected their appeal to visit the memorial that's dedicated to their service, an opportunity to honor their brothers in arms, many of whom died in that great war. And I'm pleased that the veterans, not ones to be defeated, breached the barricades and took their memorial. I've had the opportunity, my father's a World War II Navy fighter pilot, to be able to show him some of these memorials that we have and monuments here in Washington, D.C., particularly that one that was erected in the honor of his generation. But they shouldn't be denied the honor of visiting these monuments to their service. And so, Mr. President, I guess what I would say is when we're thinking about that generation of Americans, we had Senator McConnell put forward today an opportunity to address the needs of our veterans. We found out that even though the veterans budget is advance funded by a year, there are certain elements of that budget that are going to run out of money, and we want to make sure that those great generations who have served our country, defended our country around the world, have the access to the programs, the benefits that have been assured and promised them. And so I think it's unconscionable, unacceptable that we not agree to allow those services to continue to be funded. And I'm very disappointed to see our colleagues on the Democrat side resist and object to that motion here this morning, because if anything, if any group of people in this country deserves to have the respect and also the promises, honor of the promises that we've made to them, it's those American veterans. And I think if you look at the last shutdown in 1995 and 1996, President Bill Clinton came to the table and supported legislation to protect veterans programs, and I would hope that we could get some cooperation from our colleagues on the other side to do that today. I would say to my colleague from Texas.
Mr. President, may I ask how much time remains?
3 minutes.
Mr. President, I thank the Senator from South Dakota and from Missouri for making very important points. I know the leaders were, bicameral leadership of the House and the Senate were called to the White House last night, at which time, as Senator McConnell, the distinguished Republican leader, reported here on this floor, the President announced he wasn't going to negotiate. Bizarre. Why would the President call the Republican and the Democratic leadership to the White House to say, I'm not going to negotiate? Is it for a photo opportunity? Is it to give sort of some false impression that he is actually rolling up his sleeves and engaged in the business of government to which he was elected? And, you know, I hope that the President reconsiders leaving town while the government is shut down, in the words of the Majority Leader, and leaves for a trip to Asia. While, as our distinguished Democratic colleagues have pointed out, many federal employees are furloughed during this government shutdown. My hope would be that the President would cancel his trip and he'd stay here in Washington like we are and try to solve this problem and break this impasse. And these proposals that we've made here today, many of which have been voted on, of course, by the House of Representatives in a bipartisan fashion, are designed to do exactly that, to break this impasse. Yet what's the White House's response to some of the earlier proposals? They sent out a statement of administration policy saying if it's passed, I'd veto it. That's President Barack Obama. Now, how is that rolling up your sleeves and being engaged in the job you got elected to? And he earned it. He was elected twice as President of the United States. But it's not leadership to convene a meeting of Republicans and Democrat leadership at the White House, say I'm not going to negotiate, and, oh, by the way, I'm leaving town on Saturday, good luck. That leads me to conclude that the President and his party are actually enjoying this shutdown, because what they see in this is partisan political gain. They read the public opinion polls just like we do, but I don't think the American people should be fooled, and they're not being fooled. House Republicans and Republicans of the Senate have made numerous reasonable proposals only to be given the Heisman. And the President's not negotiating, and the government remains shut down. The President needs to stay here, demonstrate leadership, continue meeting with leaders on both sides of the Capitol, and we can break through this impasse, get the money to children's cancer research, get the money for the troops, open up the World War II Memorial to the honor flights coming from Texas and around the country. We can do this. They call it self-government for a reason, and we ought to be all working together toward that end.
The Republican time has expired. Under the previous order, having received from the House H.R. 3233, which is identical to S. 1566, the bill is considered read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid on the table. Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, there are 2 sides to every story.
And I'd like to say before he leaves the floor to my friend, and he is my friend, from Texas, I was at the World War II Memorial yesterday with an honor flight from Illinois. There was no barricade stopping them from going to the memorial. So the characterizations on the floor that these veterans were stopped is not true, it's not accurate, and I hope the record will reflect that. The reason why there's any question about access relates to the shutdown of the U.S. federal government, the shutdown of this government. We have passed a continuing resolution, which is a spending bill, to allow the government to function for 6 weeks. We passed it here in the Senate. The House Speaker, Mr. Boehner, refuses to call it for a vote. There's a majority, Democrats and Republicans, ready to vote for it, ready to reopen the government. No questions asked about the NIH, about the barricades at the World War II Memorial, which were there originally. All of these questions will be resolved. 3 times this morning now, the Republicans have objected to bringing that measure up for another vote in the United States Senate. That worries me. Let me say one other thing about the Affordable Care Act, the insurance exchanges. This morning, I'm sorry that he's left the floor. This morning, this is what the Republican leader, Mr. McConnell, said about the insurance exchanges. Embarrassing rollout of Obamacare exchanges on Tuesday. I mean, one of the folks the President had standing behind him at the White House tried to long audit, sign up for Obamacare, and after a couple unsuccessful attempts, the Post reports she gave up. Well, I've got good news for the senator from Kentucky. When you look across the United States of America at the insurance exchanges that have been opened, he should have, as a matter of pride, the fact that the Commonwealth of Kentucky is one of the most successful insurance exchanges in America. Listen to the report that we just received this morning from the Secretary of the Governor's Cabinet for Health, Audrey Haynes, in Kentucky. The Kentucky Insurance Exchange, which the Republicans want to close down, has had 117,000 unique visitors, 109,000 pre-screenings to determine qualifications for health insurance, 13,000 Kentuckians, already in 2 days, 13,000 have applied for health coverage, 8,000 are now complete. This is great news. They're leading the country. Kentucky should be so proud. 122 small businesses have become applications, 3,500 new families are enrolled. There have been 15,000 calls to the call center, and apologies that we haven't been able to process things as quickly in any state, but the overwhelming positive public response across America to what they call Obamacare is an indication of pent-up demand in Kentucky, Illinois, and every state for people to finally get access to health insurance. Mr. President, I see others are on the floor to speak. I just want to say to my friends on the other side of the aisle, please reopen this government. We can sit down and negotiate, and we should, about important issues. The issues that the senator from Washington has addressed in the budget. Let's address all those issues. Let's do it in a bipartisan, thoughtful, adult manner. Telling 800,000 federal employees to go home is really unfair to them, and it's unfair to this nation, and it doesn't speak well of us. The last point I'll make is this. I left the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this morning. Wendy Sherman is an Assistant Secretary of State. She is widely respected. We were talking about the threat of Iran as a nuclear power. And she said to us, and she said it with some regret, the government shutdown is hurting our efforts to stop the development of nuclear weapons in Iran. How? 90% of the employees at the Department of Treasury office responsible for monitoring Iran so that the sanctions are there and tough and bring them to the bargaining table. 90% of those federal employees have been furloughed in the Department of Treasury because the government shut down. And 72%, almost 3/4 of all the men and women at our intelligence agency in civilian capacity have been laid off as well because of the government shutdown. These are men and women charged with watching the enemy every minute of every day so that we never have another 9/11. This is one of the aspects of the government shutdown which literally jeopardizes the security of the United States of America. For goodness sakes, let's put this government back in business before the end of this day. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Illinois for reminding all of us, the many, many people and communities and economy in this country, that are being hurt today because of the Tea Party's insistence in the House of Representatives that this government remain shut until Obamacare is defunded or eliminated. Mr. President, I am frustrated like every American today, thinking, why can't our government work? Why can't people come together? As chair of the Budget Committee, I've been out here 19 times since last March saying, let's go to conference committee and resolve our differences. 19 times, members of the Republican Party have said no. They have not allowed us to go talk. So now we find ourselves in a mess. And the government is shut down, and families are hurting, and communities are hurting, and our economy is hurting. So what is the response now of the Republicans in the House of Representatives and here on the floor? Well, oops, we didn't mean to hurt everybody. We got a few friends we're going to take care of. Well, Mr. President, I've listened to the debate this morning where our Republican colleagues came out and asked unanimous consent to take care of a few of their favorite parts of government so that they can say they helped. And I am as passionate as anyone about our veterans. There is not one member of this United States Senate that doesn't fully support our military and our veterans. No one questions that. But, Mr. President, I take a back seat to no one in advocating for our veterans. As the former chair of the Veterans Committee, as the daughter of a World War II veteran who earned a Purple Heart and was the first soldiers into Okinawa, as a young woman myself during the Vietnam War, working in the Seattle Veterans Hospital with men and women my age who were coming home from the Vietnam War, from so much work I have done on this floor, working with our hundreds of thousands of veterans who are coming home from the current conflicts, passing legislation to make sure they have what they need to make sure that we don't just say thank you, but we serve them well. So I take a backseat to no one on veterans. And I can tell you one thing about our military and our veterans that everyone here knows. They are the least selfish among us. They have volunteered to serve our country. They have given up for every American. And they have a motto that they leave no one behind. No one behind. And I can't imagine that our veterans are out there today saying, take care of me with this small amendment and leave behind the children who are in our Head Start programs or the moms and dads who are dependent on nutrition programs in this country or the 800,000 employees who are sitting at home today scared to death about how they're going to pay their bills because this government is shut down. Mr. President, we have an obligation and a responsibility to solve the problems in front of us. They are widespread in terms of our differences with our Republican colleagues, but we don't do them by shutting off, closing our arms, and saying we're not going to talk about it. We do it by going to conference, and we do it by working together. We don't do it by shutting out the lights across this country on our government. So, Mr. President, in front of the House today is a solution to this. It is the Senate-passed bill that is supported by a majority in the House and would pass today if it was brought up, and a majority in this Senate today as well, to open up our government, put people back to work, and then we will go to conference. We will work out our agreements in the way that our children expect us to do. Let's be an example as adults to families across this country, to young people across this country, that when you have a disagreement, you work together at a conference table and set aside your differences and find a solution for the country. You don't do it by saying, I'm not going to let anybody go to work till I get my way, which is what the House of Representatives is doing. Mr. President, we can get this done. As I talked about yesterday, I'm a former preschool teacher, and I've seen this kind of activity before. We all see our kids go out and make a mess in their room and then go, gosh, how did that happen? That's what we're hearing from the other side today. Well, gee, how come we haven't passed any appropriations bills? Well, wow, if we had a budget done, we wouldn't be here. Well, Why has that happened? Because time after time, and the chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee is here, as we've tried to get our work done, we've been blocked by the very same Tea Party Republicans who today have put us into this shutdown and said, my way or the highway, you either repeal Obamacare or this country hurts. Mr. President, that is not what we should be doing. Let's tell our veterans, let's tell our military, let's tell our Head Start moms, let's tell our 800,000 employees, let's tell everybody in this country, we are a country that can work, we're at business, open our doors, pass the legislation in the House, and then we will work out our disagreements. Hard as it is, we can do that. Mr. President, I hope that's the focus we have today. I say to Speaker Boehner, bring up the bill and pass it and allow us to get back to work. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.